Chapter 7. Marshalling of the Undead. Brox quickly learned that he did not need to use the reins. The miniature mules automatically made every turn at each junction and took side trails, deviating from main roads when shortcuts became available. Nevertheless, Brox held onto the reins out of habit. He made his way through a variety of terrains, observing things such as watering holes with deer, small patches of wild flowers, and areas with jagged rocks that had been splintered by the careless actions of a clan of rock trolls in ages past. He found himself fighting off a frightening sense of forlorn. Here he traveled far from friends back at Rustic Haven, without the help of his old buddy Thistlethorn, and even missing the kind company of Tralinda. Toward the evening, this forsaken feeling washed away as the miniature mule troika came around a bend and over a small ridge. There, not more than a couple of miles away, sat a cluster of buildings and houses. Candlelight already seeping out of the windows. At least, he thought to himself. There will be someone to chat with and swap tales, not to mention hot food. Speaking of food, he had totally forgotten about the small sack of victuals that the brownie had placed in the back of the cart. It made him a bit more cheerful that he would have hot food tonight and would still have the flavoursome brownie provisions for tomorrow. Riding into the midst of the cluster of buildings, he pulled the miniature mule troika to a standstill. "Young man," he called to a boy about his own height, perhaps a bit taller. "Could you tell me where I might find an inn for the evening?" The boy walked over to him, first looking at the miniature mules and then at the gnome. "Jarvan Dart runs an inn of about 8 rooms. It's over yonder." He pointed to a stone building that sat next to a giant weeping willow. "It's called Plank and Pulley." "That's sort of an unusual name." "Jarvan Dart is a good, honest man. He, is not very original, however. He made up the name for the inn one day as he watched one of the walls on the second floor being built. He saw a plank being pulled up by a pulley. The boy chuckled at the story a little and walked back to his yard to feed some chickens. Brox made his way to the plank and pulley and left the miniature mules in the stable with an elderly man who earned his keep as a groom at the inn. After grabbing his possessions out of the back of the cart, Brox entered the plank and pulley. "Good evening, sir." The voice originated from a husky man with bulbous sideburns. Brox could only assume that he was Jarvan Dart. "You will be staying in room 6 tonight. Place your baggage upstairs, and I'll make some good cooking for you when you get back down." He smiled and went back to serving a pair of farmer's tall mugs filled with an off-white liquid. Brox felt surprised, but pleased, with the way Jarvan Dart seemed well prepared for his arrival. The man acted as if he already expected Brox. Perhaps, thought Brox, the boy had forewarned the plank and pulley owner of his entrance, or that the man had a keen sense of knowing a traveller when he saw one. Brox entered room 6, noting that the door had already been unlocked. These people are very prepared, or... Now, something seemed a bit out of place about the whole ordeal, and Brox, after the encounters with the zombie moths, the giant, and 2 trips into the Dara cemetery, felt that he should be cautious. The fact that the inn's owner knew of his coming and the fact that the door was conveniently unlocked gave him cause for concern. So he entered the room, nonchalantly, but taking his time to look around before placing his carpet bag, sack, and backpack on the table. He made it a point to hold onto the sledgehammer. After looking around the room again, Brox walked over to the window, unlatched the shutters, and threw them open. In the last remnants of the fading sunlight, he could see a small garden with its neatly arranged rows of beans, carrots, tomatoes, and lettuce. He also saw an out-of-the-way spot for sweet corn and radishes. An old splintered, rickety fence surrounded the garden. In the distance, he could see the shadowy form of various conifers as they mingled amid the darkening skies. Like an oil painting with colors smeared together. Over the past few days, the gnome had learned to handle the sledgehammer quite well. While staring at the obscure form of a squirrel making its way up the side of an elm tree, he hefted the bulky tool onto his shoulder. The entire time, he constantly tried to look blasé. After glancing at a patch of razor-edge grasses, Brox heard a sharp whisper come from the shadows behind him. "Going to attack me with that sledgehammer? Going to knock down the walls so that the roof collapses on me? Why don't you just put that makeshift weapon down?" I am sure that it would be to the benefit of both of us, if you did so. Just put it down. Do not fail me. Since Brox had been prepared to use the sledgehammer on some assassin sent by the Shaden morgue, his natural inclination was to turn and attack. But Brox did a very strange thing instead. Yes, a very strange thing indeed. He did as the unseen speaker had bid him to do. Brox was not under a charm spell or a friend spell when he tossed the sledgehammer onto the bed, and therefore, he was not forced to comply against his own will or better judgment. No, he put down the makeshift weapon because he recognized the last sentence of the unseen speaker as something that Thistlethorn had said time after time to him in good humor back in their adventuring days. "Where are you hiding?" asked Brox. "Up here," replied Thistlethorn. Brox looked up at the top of a tall dresser, expecting to see his old friend. "Not there. Over here." Brox turned around and found Thistlethorn scrunched up in the corner of the room with his back flat against the ceiling, one foot on a tapestry, and the other foot on a high shelf. How he managed to stay balanced, Brox had no idea. Yet, there he lingered, looking down at the gnome. Fascinating. Vastly fascinating. Brox was truly impressed. "How long have you been there?" Thistlethorn jumped down, flipping twice, landing on the bed, and doing a backspring from there onto the floor where he came up on his feet. "As soon as you started walking up the stairwell." The two of them clasped hands in a firm handshake that spoke of genuine appreciation for seeing each other. They spoke no words, just being glad that the other lived. Brox started the conversation. "I have not had a meal since this morning, and I am a bit chilled from my journey. I saw a couple of empty tables by the fireplace. Let's go see if one of them is still available and get a hot meal." The inn's main dining hall proved a friendly, cluttered mess with hot cauldrons bubbling and churning, gales of noisy laughter, and the constant clatter of plates, bowls, and silverware. They saw wear marks and scratches in the wooden tables from years of banqueting. They slipped past long sets of shelves that were stuffed full of jars of jam, canisters of oregano and onion spices, stacks of wooden and pewter cups, and glass-covered loaves of bread. One table had several men sitting at it. Each man used a spoon as big as a ladle to scrape up spicy soup with thick slices of carrots in clay soup bowls. Somewhere, in a back parlor, the high-pitched sounds of a lute being played by a wandering minstrel could be heard. Brox and Thistlethorn weaved around tables and chairs, being mindful of a serving girl who carried several plates of food and an equal number of filled-to-the-brim mugs. To get to one of the empty tables by the fireplace, they had to walk along a wall lined with rotting wooden barrels. As to why the barrels even existed inside the dining hall, the two little men could only make a guess, and both of them chose not to guess. When they made it to one of the empty tables, they both climbed up into high-backed chairs made out of solid oak. Thistlethorn's chair had one uneven leg, so he pulled out a copper coin, dropped to the ground, and slid it under the uneven leg, moving it a few times to get it into the right place. Brox sat quietly with his chin almost on the table, a table not designed for gnomes, but for the two talls. He listened to the conversation coming from an adjacent table as an old man spoke loud enough for all within a dozen feet to easily hear him. "This is no ordinary gravy on these here smashed potatoes. No, no. Not at all." Brox looked at the gravy, which appeared to be ordinary white gravy with pepper sprinkled on top. "This here gravy comes from the good governor's black Angus cow. Made from the milk of the very cow that ate them their mice. Yes, yes. 24 white mice. Nice mice. Plump, very plump they were, having lived off the good governor's stockpile of corn, bran, and barley oats. So much did the mice eat that they could not run any more." He scooped up a spoonful and slowly dumped it back onto the potatoes. The good governor's black Angus cow moseyed on over to the feed barrels and knocked the lid off one of them. Helped itself it did to the feed, gulping down in big mouthfuls before it was ushered out onto the pasture. It ate the mice, all the mice. Now, this gravy has its own sharp taste. You may not be able to tell, but I can tell that this gravy is different. It's got its own piquant taste. I call it mice spice. Having said that, the old man began to devour his meal in silence, taking time to savor the gravy. After Thistlethorn climbed back into his chair, Brox leaned forward and said in a whisper, "I don't recommend anything with gravy." The shortling raised an eyebrow at this strange proclamation. When Brox leaned back in his chair, keeping his composure, Thistlethorn took this in stride and decided to avoid ordering anything with gravy. They sat at a square table that had been polished so well that traces of the flickering light from the lamps could be seen dancing across the top. The fireplace had not been stoked in a while, and only one log lay burning in the midst of a pile of red-hot embers. On their table rested a trio of mucky green candles that had melted down into one large puddle of wax, seeping into the table cracks. Only one of the 3 wicks burned, and even that proved to be a tedious flame. Some almost empty jars of jelly were stacked in the center, with the bottommost one showing signs of mold. A covered bowl held chunks of salt, and another bowl that presumably held pepper looked empty. The two of them made small talk, not of the past few days, but of other mundane things such as the weather and the friendly atmosphere of the inn. After finishing a meal of toast and quince conserve, omelets with cheddar cheese, ham, and mushrooms, and a sweet dessert called brickle mush, Brox finally brought up the subject of recent events. "So, what's your story?" asked Brox, spreading a blueberry jam over a piece of lightly browned toast. "Well, when the griffin yanked me off of my feet, I immediately feigned death." Brox had a puzzled look on his face. "You feigned death?" "Yes. A griffin is an intelligent hunter. If it senses that its prey is still alive, it will continue to claw it until it dies. I did not feel like being clawed to death, so I acted like I was already dead." Brox accepted that as a fact of griffin ecology and a prudent decision to feign death. "It was obvious to me that I was being taken to its nest where I would be devoured by it and others of its ilk. In fact, I could see the nest and 2 other griffins circling above it, making ear-splitting cries when they saw us about 3 or 4 furlongs away. While this transpired, I managed to tie my rope to my backpack and cut the backpack loose. Holding the backpack in one hand, I anchored the other end of my rope to my belt. When the griffin leveled out at treetop level, I dropped my backpack. As I had hoped, the backpack got tangled in some branches, and the rope went taut. My goal was to be jerked free of the griffin's grip, but its talons were too well sunk into my leather armor. We were pulled downward where we landed hard in a mix of boulders and pine tree saplings. We hit the ground so hard that both of us were momentarily stunned. The griffin broke a wing at this time. I don't remember the griffin letting go of me, but I did find myself free. I made haste into the woods, but the creature pursued me in rapid accord. I think it would have finished me off, but suddenly, 2 arrows hit it in the right side. It tried to fly away but could not due to the aforementioned broken wing. The griffin turned to meet this new threat, giving me a chance to backstab it, causing it to cease attacking and take up screeching instead. In short, 6 Imperial soldiers rushed the griffin and quickly finished it off. "How did you chance upon Imperial soldiers in the forest?" "They had been commissioned by some local earl to track down the griffins and slay them. They had been watching the griffin carry me and were able to quickly come to my rescue." Brox expressed his renewed appreciation for Imperial soldiers, since their hasty response saved the life of his friend. Thistlethorn went on to explain how he had been taken to the Earl's manor where he had been healed by a local healer and paid a bounty. "They paid you?" asked Brox incredulously. "Yes. There is a bounty for killing a griffin. Since I was the one who brought it down to the ground, breaking its wing, and placed the crippling backstab blow to it, I received a bounty. They determined that the healing of my wounds, several days' rest in the palace, and 10 gold crowns was to be a fair amount. I was just thankful to be alive and told them that I did not feel the need to be paid. But they compelled me to take the reward, telling me that the reputation of the earldom to make good its promise of payment was at stake." Thistlethorn leaned back in his chair as the serving girl refilled his mug, thanking her when she finished. "Where did you head after that?" asked Brox. "Well, I was making my way to the realm of Sedu, hoping to catch up with you." Brox raised an eyebrow. "Now that I have found you, I figure that we can take the wide east-west expanse road. It will take about 9 or 10 days to get there. Thistlethorn paused. I am very surprised that you aren't a couple of days or so ahead of me, especially with that miniature mule troika. The shortling folded his arms. I guess that you ran into some brownies. They are the only ones that use such a mode of transportation. I did run into some brownies. In a moment I can explain to you why I am not days further along. A hard look crossed his face. Moreover, we don't have 9 or 10 days to get to the realm of Seju, but I know a shortcut. Let me explain what has transpired. Brox did just that, starting with the events along the GW Woods, going to his encounter with the graveyard in the mist, speaking of his trip to the bed and breakfast, and finally telling his friend of his time at Cloaktoft's Manor, which included his experience in the Time Shifter. Thistlethorn listened attentively, gasping at certain descriptions and noticing the way that Brox spoke affectionately of Tralinda. So, you plan to use the Crossdown world as a backdoor entrance? Thistlethorn's voice trailed off. That sounds a little on the perilous side, tramping through a dungeon that has been lost to legends. While he spoke, a bard named Mark the Versifier passed by their table, stopped, and looked at them. Good evening, sirs, he said. Care for a song? He took off his cap and held it out. This action was customary among bards, giving a potential patron a chance to toss a few copper coins or even a silver noble into the hat. If the patron placed some money into the hat, the bard would tell his tale or sing his song. The more money dropped in the hat, the longer the bard would go. How long is your song? Asked Thistlethorn. I know a good short one. The bard figured that they sought for the cheapest version. That was all that most people wanted, so the bard focused on it in hopes of some copper coins. Do you know Suya? The bard's eyes went wide. Perhaps he would get 5 or 6 copper coins or even a silver noble. Suya was one of the first songs my grandfather taught me, and he taught me all of the verses, not just the standard 3. Do you know it in D sharp? Asked the shortling. Yes. Excellent, said Brox, speaking for the first time since the bard had wandered by. Mark the Versifier watched Thistlethorn pull out a handful of copper coins and call over the serving girl at the same time. He ordered 3 flagons of burnt cider, they did not have berry budge, and gave one to Brox and one to the bard, keeping the last for himself. Mark the Versifier thanked him and sighed a little. He sighed because the shortling only had 3 copper coins left. Oh well, 3 copper coins and a flagon of burnt cider was fair enough, he had only hoped for more because he felt very hungry and had no coins in his money bag. Then Mark the Versifier watched as the shortling placed the 3 copper coins back into his own pocket and fished around in the same pocket for another bit of money. A tight smile played across the bard's face as he realized that the little man was going to pay a silver noble, a hefty sum that would take care of his monetary needs for the rest of the night and pay for breakfast, too. However, the bard stared thunderstruck when he saw Thistlethorn pull out a gold crown. And we will get you a quarter of a cheese will with a plate of rye bread, if it is thorough, said Brox, dispassionately taking a quaff of his burnt cider. The bard just looked at the 2 little men, taking in the fact that they were willing to give him a full gold crown, enough money to last him several days. Not only would he have an adequate amount of money for food and lodging, he could pay the ferryman to cross the Swilwash River. Usually, he had to swim across the river, placing his possessions on a personally constructed raft. He felt so astonished that he could only nod his head and whisper, gladly. The bard began to let his fingers glide across the fretted fingerboard of the lute. Brock studied the musical instrument, which had a curved spine ending in the head of a dragon with rows of teeth and several spikes running across the top of its head. The tuning pegs looked like the wings of a falcon or eagle with worn, round-edge feathers. Brock seemed most impressed with the fact that it had been constructed from a lightly stained, polished rosewood, carved with extreme workmanship, and hardened with Aleutian oil. The bard shuffled his feet slowly, not a dance, but a slow, well-paced, graceful catwalk. As the lutenist reached the side of the table by the fireplace, he made a fancy jump that reminded both of the little men of a Lutz. He sang the entire song in a low bass voice that reverberated through the dining hall, causing several other patrons to stop talking and listen. To the surprise of the bard and all of the patrons, but not Surprising to Brox, Thistlethorn stood up on the top of the back of the chair, it being a generous inch thick. Even though this top was only about 1.5 feet long, he began to spin and twist with backflips, cartwheels, handsprings, and full round-offs. The bard followed suit by increasing the tempo and putting a sharp staccato at the end of each stanza. The crowd became mesmerized, even Jarvan Dart stopped wiping clean mugs, and the serving girl simply sat down to watch Thistlethorn's nimble dance. Brox moved the bard's hat to the edge of the table so others could drop a copper coin or two into it. In fact, the bard gleaned 17 extra copper coins. He later thanked the gnome for his thoughtfulness. When the bard finished his song and Thistlethorn did one last rocker cartwheel, the entire dining hall filled with a thunderous roar of applause, whistles, and plate pounding. Mark the versifier, as a token of gratitude, asked if he could tell them a tale. Both of the little men nodded and requested simultaneously, anything about the Crossdown world. Mark the versifier nodded and spoke a brief palinode which included a portion of an obscure ballad about the Crossdown world. Most of the palinode spoke of different wars, strange storms, and trolls, including the notoriously insane troll, Rock Grinder. Of course, he spoke of a lost princess and the rescuing prince. Both Brox and Thistlethorn leaned closer when the bard began to speak about the Crossdown world. And yet the trapdoor is under a pool full of silver. The bard said something about a lost orc that started a minor feud, and then he spoke about the Crossdown world, again. When walking through the room below the pool of silver, backward you must go to make the twin mirrors touch. Brox and Thistlethorn looked at each other, hoping to make some sense out of this strange riddle. Yet, they would have to wait until later to consider the words, for the bard now thanked them for everything. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Back in the room, they continued their conversation, not of the palinode from the bard, but of the events of Thistlethorn's travels to the inn. So, yesterday as I walked past the monument of the Iron Sundial I remembered the documentary on liches. He pulled it out. It gave a reasonable description of such undead creatures. Brox had pushed 2 overstuffed chairs together and made up a bed for the shortling to sleep in. Therefore, Thistlethorn suggested that he read the documentary to Brox. He flipped through the documentary, looking at the brief, orderly write-ups on liches. Liches. A Brief Examination. By Lester Dumas. Purpose: a lich subsists as an augmentation of its own desire, force of willpower, to continue to live after it has died. It is believed that it uses esoteric magic to achieve this state, but no formal studies have been made on this conclusion. This notion is based solely upon the fact that only former spellcasters such as mags, excluding illusionist specialists, and clerics, excluding druids, ever become liches. Description of appearance: most liches appear to be typical skeletons when viewed from a distance. One of the few telltale signs that the undead creature is a lich and not a skeleton is that they tend to be dressed in fine array reserved for nobility. Most of the time, their eyes radiate a pale yellow light. Some have crimson-red eyes and others have off-white hues. The reason for these different colors is not understood. They can see equally well in the dark as well as in the light. Special attacks: liches can use the most formidable magic spells known. They seem to wield, with immense power, spells that cause physical maladies, example, paralysis, blindness, deafness, rotting bones, decaying flesh, etc. They manipulate curses on a significant scale, too. Special defenses: it is ironic that a lich appears to be little more than a skeleton in a regal outfit, yet it has the durability of a knight in molten forged, plate mail armor. Most weapons bend, break, or glance off a lich. Even those that do make solid contact typically cause little permanent damage. A.K.A. Invincible, unless the phylactery has been destroyed. See below. Magically endued weapons tend to fare better. Another ability of the lich is to strike forlorn terror into most who see them. Due to their control of magic, nearly all spells used directly against them have a minimal effect. Weaknesses: each lich has a phylactery that permits its undead condition. This phylactery is easily broken, but virtually impossible to find. Liches go to great extent to conceal their individual phylactery, making false duplicates in conjunction with the real one. Destroying the phylactery does not destroy the lick. However, destroying the phylactery is necessary before the lick can be permanently killed. Those without a phylactery are no longer invincible. Strategies of combat. Liches have patience that extends into the sphere of centuries. They plot and plan for decades before making even a small move. They rely upon magic and undead creatures to do their work. Liches have about as much regard for the living as the living have for diseases. Conclusion: a single lick can be as dangerous as a fielded army. Do not meddle with a lick. After this, Thistlethorn saw a noticeable apprehension in Brox's eyes. Hearing about liches proved easy. Knowing that you rushed to face a lick proved another thing. His eyes strayed over to a candelabrum that spiraled downward on a tall pole. He became so distracted by what he just heard that he could not tell if there were 14 or 15 candles on the candelabrum, despite many attempts to count them. But there is something else, said Thistlethorn. Brox quit trying to count the candles and tossed a pillow onto the bed he had made for the shortling. After twisting one of the chairs into place, he looked at the documentary. Here. Thistlethorn handed the documentary to Brox. Neither one of us noticed that someone had written a very, very faded note on the back of the last page. Squinting his eyes, Brox read the scribbled words written in very tiny print. I have spent several years trying to find out what the Shadenmorg's master plan is. Brox stopped reading and looked at Thistlethorn. I know what you are going to ask. No, I don't know who wrote that. But you will see that there is a date on it, just a notch over 50 years ago. Brox nodded his head and continued. I managed to locate the Shadenmorg's childhood home, about an hour's walk north of what once had been the city of Calaturn. According to a well-preserved census register, the Shadenmorg's family name was Agewood. I found the gate arches that stood before the Agewood family house. The name was still visible on the archway. For several days, I searched the ruins of the Agewood estate, digging through heaps of broken stones that once served as walls. Not until the fourth day did I realize that one room, a former sitting parlor as far as I could tell, was covered with stones. Someone had placed the stones there on purpose. I suspect that this may have been the intentional work of the Shadenmorg. It took nearly a week, but I managed to clear away enough of the stones to find a stairwell, which was filled with more stones, that ended at a locked iron door. The door had rusted, and I easily pulled it off its hinges. Behind the door stretched a straight, perfectly cut passageway made of grey block stones, blocks that were polished to a dull sheen. The floor had no trace of dust. The passageway narrowed several times, forcing me to squeeze sideways to get through various parts. Eventually, I came to another iron door. This one was in excellent condition, and I knew that I would not be able to pull it off its hinges. Fortunately, the door was not locked. It opened into, as far as I could tell, a little demiplane, an isolated dimension that was surrounded by a rolling, bubbling, twisting, black wall of nothingness. Brox stopped reading. He was about to explain that he had seen such a wall when he had been in the Dara cemetery. Then he decided he could explain that later. He continued to read. I saw a parcel of ground about 1 or 2 acres in size. I could see a forest filled with the life of animals, insects, flowers, bushes, and trees. Above glowed a clear blue sky and a warm Sunday. I made my way over to a flowing brook and sat down on a bench that rested under the thick boughs of a tree. As I glanced at a pair of chipmunks that were collecting a handful of walnuts, I noticed that the shadows cast by the trees were quickly swallowed up in darkness. Looking upward, I could see jaunting, rumbling, rolling masses of black, oh, so black. Clouds begin to fill the sky, blocking the sun out completely. Then, it began to rain. Thick, goopy, inky black raindrops began to fall. Instead of getting everything wet as rain normally does, it destroyed the living. Leaves wilted and burned away to ashes, stripping the trees down to bare branches. A deer galloping across the field began to get hit by the raindrops. But when the drops of rain hit its fur, the fur fell off in clumps, leaving only the hide. The deer kept on running. More rain fell on the animal, burning off its skin, muscles, and tendons. Soon, only its skeletal bones remained. At that point, the skeletal deer saw me, turned, and charged. I ran as fast as I could, exposing myself to the rain. My coat protected me for the most part, but my hands and face got hit. I felt my skin burning off. It was not painful, but numbing like frost-chilled skin. I made my way back to the door. As I passed through, I could see thousands of moths flying toward me, but they were dead moths. While slamming the door shut, it occurred to me that the Shaden Morg plans to set up his own domain through this death rain and the attacks of undead creatures. When he plans to do this, I do not know. I have since learned that this is called the marshalling of the undead. Quite frightful, noted a horrified Brox, thinking of the marshalling of the undead. Thistlethorn nodded his head and remained quiet a long time before speaking. I find that handwritten note more terrifying than the documentary proper. But there is something else. I did not know when I was going to tell you this, but now is as good a time as any. Thistlethorn swallowed. When I was having my wounds tended to, I heard the servants of the Earl speaking in hushed tones to one another. The words that they shared with one another were words of bitter gloom and sulky misery. They spoke of dead insects that littered the floor of the foyer, their dead legs and antennas occasionally twitching. Well water drawn after sunset became filled with weeds and silt and was brackish in nature. Shadows at night would be cast in the opposite direction. That is to say, toward the candlelight, not away from it. In the attic, sounds could be heard, including voices and footfalls. When Brox heard this latter point, he raised an eyebrow questioningly. Thistlethorn went on to explain the voices and footfalls. When a servant and a couple of Imperial soldiers went to investigate one such occurrence, they found no one. Nothing had been disturbed. They did say that they heard the slamming of doors and someone running out of the attic, but there were no doors in the attic, save the one in the floor through which they had entered. Brox nodded his thanks for the explanation. Thistlethorn continued. The Earl himself complained that the torchlight in his bedchamber made everything appear black, white, and shades of grey. I don't know if those problems occurred because I was there, but I sure hope that they left when I left. I doubt that they were related to you, said Brox, opening a window to the outside. As if to prove that the strange happenings spoken of by the Earl's servants had nothing to do with Thistlethorn, both little men could hear a conversation from outside between some locals and their family members that lived a dozen leagues to the southwest, a place where neither had ever been. Both groups of people compared stories of backward shadows, dead insects that twitched, bad well water, and such. They also spoke of cracks forming on grave markers and the fact that sarcophagus lids were sometimes found ajar. When they were resealed in the evening, they would be found ajar in the morning. A group of militia men stayed in a cemetery one night to find out who had been tampering with the lids of various sarcophagi. No one knows what happened, but all of the militia men were found huddled in one corner of the cemetery the next morning, too terrified to speak of what they had seen in the night. Brox eventually closed the window. He glanced out the window as he closed it, wondering if he would see a horde of undead marching down the hill. There ensued a long silence. "Tomorrow," said Brox, "we can make our way to the Crosdown world." Brox looked over at the shortling, only to find him fast asleep on the makeshift bed of 2 chairs. The gnome stood silently in the room holding a blanket that had on it a design of children skipping stones on a calm lake. He looked at a chrome-hooded lantern that rested on top of the dresser. The flame inside burned a brilliant yellow-white, but a scarce amount of light radiated out due to the fact that the glass plate on it appeared almost a solid black from smoke soot. His natural inclination was to take a cloth and clean the glass plate, but he did not see a cleaning cloth. He watched the light for a moment longer, wondering if zombie moths were attracted to light as their living counterparts were. When he tired of this train of thought, he put out the lantern's light and went to bed.